Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in today for Kirby Anderson. We have a very exciting show coming up. We'll start out this hour with Representative James White. He's a Texas state representative who has been working on criminal justice issues and other things related to that. And we're going to be talking to him about criminal justice, the social justice issues, the racial protests that are going on in the country, and what all that means, and some of his thoughts on it and what Texas can do. When we go to the second hour, we'll start that out with Sidney Powell. Sidney Powell is an attorney who took over Michael Flynn's case. Michael Flynn is a longtime friend and operative with Donald Trump. Sidney took over that role of managing his legal proceedings, several months ago when it looked like Flynn was all but done for, and she turned that thing around. She was going to be with us for a long while, for the whole hour, but it turns out because of what's going on with the appeals court there, the D.C. appeals court, and Michael Flynn's case, she can only join us for 15 minutes. So she's going to join us at the top of the next hour to talk a bit about what's happening there. We'll turn from that to the issue of Barry Weiss. Barry Weiss was the New York Times op-ed page editor who resigned very publicly a couple of days ago with a very public letter about the problems that are going on at the New York Times and the media in general. It's things we've been talking about. It's things we sort of known have been happening, but the mainstream media deny it. Barry Weiss's letter is very revealing, and we'll look at that. We'll finish that hour talking with Tom Giovanetti of the Institute for Policy Innovation about social media companies, the large social media companies and the internet, and their obligation to be fair, to what extent they have to do that, whether or not they've been targeting conservatives, and whether or not there needs to be a backlash. In the final hour, we're going to talk to Michael Schellenberger. Michael Schellenberger was a longtime activist in the environmental movement who came to the conclusion eventually that there's so many problems in the environmental movement. He believes in climate change. He believes that the globe is warming, but he sees so many things that the environmental movement does as being hyperbolic, counterproductive, hurting the very people they're trying to help, and oftentimes hypocritical. So it will be an interesting session there. He's got a large book out, just came out this year, talking about the problems and addressing some of those issues. He still believes that the Earth is warming, but he thinks there are better ways to handle it and to address the changes that are coming. So we're looking forward to that. But let's start out right now with Representative James White, who's joining us from his home in Tyler County in Texas. Representative White, are you with us?
I'm doing fine. I'm with you. Thank you so much for having me on this afternoon.
Thank you so much. You know, you have got such an interesting biography there. You got your undergraduate degree at the University of Houston, I think. You got it at where you got it from. Undergraduate degree in Houston, and then you went to Prairie View A&M University, and then you finally got a doctorate from the University of Houston in political science, I believe. Went to be a teacher. Well, you were in the Army for a while, were teaching for a while, and 10 years ago you decided to run for the State House in Texas. What made you decide to take that step?
Thank you so much, Merrill, for that, and I'm just extremely proud to represent the 5 counties I have the greatest set of Texans in this great state in Polk, Tyler, Jasper, Newton, and Hardin counties, excuse me. And
that's a tall claim, the greatest set of Texans, because there's a lot of great Texans.
Yeah, but I've got the best set. Okay, we're all great, but I've got the best of the best. And if you think about 2011 or 2010 rather, going into 2011, we were looking at the things that were going in our country. We were coming out of a very tough, economic downturn.
Mm-hmm.
We had a presidential administration, the Obama administration, that was running roughshod over people's economic liberties, their religious liberties. And I was sitting in the classroom looking at the generations that will have to buy it in the future. And I thought that that was the time for me to get off the couch. Nothing against Fox News, but we got to get off the couch, get out of the front of the TV, stop talking to the TV, go out and talk to Texans. That's what we did in 2010, and apparently it worked out for us.
Apparently. Now, you are chairman of the House Committee on Corrections. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what President Trump signed the First Step Act back in December 2018. That was a major criminal justice reform, and this had been going on for 8 or 10 years, where both conservatives and liberals had sort of joined hands saying we need to reform the criminal justice system and make some changes out there. And it finally happened with the First Step Act. What are your thoughts on the First Step Act?
Well, let me tell you, I'm so proud of President Trump. This is someone who came out of industry. He's a businessman, someone that didn't really have to do this. He's been successful all of his life. And then he decides to run for president and do something for the country. And he is setting such a great example, at least politically, for conservatives. Sit down, listen. It's okay to sit down and listen to all sides, but then when you make a decision, you come up with the best constitutional conservative option. And this is a strong law and order guy. I'm a strong law and order guy. I don't think you can have criminal justice reform without law and order, okay? And so we're very proud of the president. He accomplished something that Republicans and Democrats have asked Republican and Democrat administrations to do for decades. He went in, he got it done, and it's a very conservative piece of legislation, because if you think of some of the things that we were having federal prosecutors prosecute, these small, low-level drug crimes, that is an encroachment of a growth of federal power. These are crimes and offenses that need to be adjudicated and dealt with locally by our local DAs, our local judges, and our local state criminal justice system. So I'm very supportive of that piece of legislation, and I'm also supportive of it and proud of it, because many of the facets of it, a lot of the energy behind it, were the reforms that we have done here in Texas for more than 10 years.
Well, it's interesting because you hit on something, that there is a federal role of crime, and mostly crime is a state and local issue, and there have been some overlaps in those over the years. So when we come back from the break, I'd like you to take a minute to explain what you think those differences should be. Where's the proper federal role on crime, and where's the proper state role and the local role, and how do you distinguish between those, and who should have the sort of the lead on addressing crime? So our guest this hour, Representative James White from Texas. He is the chairman of the House Committee on Corrections. And when we come back, we're going to continue our discussion on crime and criminal justice. Stay with us.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, in the midst of the debates about which lives matter is a more important question as to why lives matter at all. This is not a commentary about Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. This is a more fundamental question. If you start with an evolutionary view that all life is a result of chance, then on what basis can you argue that any life is more important than any other? One of the guests on my radio program argues that if you accept naturalistic Darwinism, then no lives matter. So in the midst of this debate and discussion, you would hope that Americans living in a society influenced by Judeo-Christian values might have a better answer. But that is not what George Barna has found in his latest survey through the Cultural Research Center. He concluded that less than 4 in 10 of Americans today view human life as having unconditional intrinsic worth. Most of these people are found in the deeply religious segments of society. You know, as you might expect, an evolutionary view surfaced in the research. 1 out of 8 claimed that people are merely material substance or biological machines. Even more interesting was the fact that another 1/8 argued that people are part of the mind of the universe. Some people even argue that humans are an illusion, and others said that we're a sleeping god, part of the soul of the universe. A substantial share of the population combined to offer views such as life is what you make it, but it has no absolute value, and life does not attain its full value until we reach our highest point of evolution and expression. All of this suggests that the best question to ask is why any life matters and on what basis. Americans obviously have some very confused ideas about this. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. Merrill Matthews from the Institute for Policy Innovation sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And with me on the phone, Texas State Representative James White. And we're talking about criminal justice issues right now. And Representative White, the conservatives have had a long time push to try to keep the federal government from getting involved in things that it doesn't have a constitutional role to get involved in. That's the federalist system that we and historically, crime and those types of things have been state and or local issues. So, what is the act we're talking about is actually a federal law. What is the federal government's role in criminal justice, and what should be left to the states and the local communities?
Well, I think when we read, and thank you for that question, Merrill, I think when we read the Constitution, when we read the commentaries about the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and other founding documents, the role of the federal government, regardless of the issue, should be few and defined. So it would be those offenses that truly have an interstate nexus, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I would say it's those. So when we see recently, when I say recently, I'm talking within the last 30 to 40 years, with so much of the federal criminal code just expanding, along with all the business regulations, just expanding. And you see the federal prison population explode along with the cost associated, we would say that's big government. If I could do this, I just want to weigh in this way when you say, because I know the next point is, well, what really is the state role? And that would be just everything else, right? especially if you're a big states' rights guy, which I am. But when we look at this issue of criminal justice reform, okay, or criminal justice, period, those of us that are believers, we believe in our Lord Jesus Christ, that he died for our sin. I believe in the book of Matthew, Jesus was very, very specific about visiting, rehabilitating, not forgetting those that are in prison. This is an issue for you. If you are a conservative that's always concerned about our constitutional moorings and foundation, when you see just the gross, federal and state abuse of the criminal code, this is a area that we need conservatives. If you're a fiscal conservative, and again, when you see the explosion on the federal and state level of the cost, and then you also have to ask yourself, well, what has been the benefit? Okay, this is a place for conservatives. Obviously, as conservatives, we're always, concerned about the protection of life and order. This is the role of the criminal justice system. So this is the paramount conservative issue, criminal justice, because it has a nexus with so many other issues that conservatives are concerned with.
So what had gotten out of whack that we needed reform? I mean, is it that the justice system was just locking people up and not reforming them, not trying to rehabilitate them? What had gotten out of whack that we needed to make changes?
Well, I think you're on to something there. We really it got out of whack where I believe we were not really making a distinction between victim and victimless crimes. But let me just give you a very simplistic notion. Mm-hmm. There are people that, frankly, they make me mad. Okay, all right. Maybe they smoke marijuana. Or maybe they do something else that really makes me mad. Okay, I don't like it, and there's good reasons for me not to like it. But I have to also ask the question, what is that individual's behavior? What is their threat to my safety, the protection of my property? Okay. And then you have the people that make you scared. Okay. And those are the people that are murdering, doing aggravated robbery, actually destroying property, and a threat to life. Those are the people that last group, those are the people that we primarily need to look at as far as confinement, okay? On some of these other offenses, we should be looking at front-end rehabilitative efforts first and foremost, which happen to be, Merrill, more effective and at the same time more cost-effective also. So I think we just got out of whack a little bit with just criminalizing just too much. Okay.
For years, I would have thought that I generally trusted the justice system. So if someone were found guilty by a jury of some crime, I thought very, very good chance that person did it. I thought there was just very little chance that innocent people were actually sent to jail. And then came the Innocence Project. And as I've watched the Innocence Project over the years, and people coming out where prosecutors did not necessarily provide exculpatory evidence, or they didn't do the DNA that they should have done and able to in order to find out the person was actually guilty. And we've seen in states across the country individuals who were incarcerated for, in many cases, years and years for a crime that it came out later, once they were able to do the DNA test or something of that nature, that they just clearly did not commit. Didn't mean they were innocent of everything in their life, but they didn't commit that crime. What are your thoughts on the Innocence Project? And that at least made me think something's not working right here if you have some of these cases coming up like this. It sort of seemed like maybe there's more of those out there that we just haven't been able to uncover yet.
Yes. Well, we value the work of the Innocence Project. We always value the work generally throughout government, but definitely in the criminal justice system, where we truly seek justice and truth. At the same time, State Representative White is a supporter of allowing our states and local communities to hold that discretion and have that discretion of the death penalty. And why is that? Because I believe it's in Romans 13 that pretty much says that, you know, government as an institution, an earthly institution allowed by God, it has a responsibility to avenge innocent blood. So with that, government even has a responsibility to make sure that discretion of taking a life that has spilled innocent blood, it's important that it's done rightly and justly. So we value work of the Innocence Project. A lot of the work that they have done has resulted and continues to result in changes that we make in the criminal justice system. And it's, you know, I've talked to some of these men and women that were probably moments away from having their life ended due to a you know, not being guilty. I mean, being innocent and not being guilty.
Well, it's amazing stuff. But the recent protests that we've seen, part of the movement behind that is the criminal justice system is unfair to minorities, especially blacks. They get harsher treatment. They're arrested more. They get higher fines. They get worse attorneys if they have to rely upon a court-appointed attorney and so forth. We've only got about a minute and a half left in this segment, but give me some initial thoughts, and we'll come back to it in a minute. What is there some justification behind the protests that we've seen, not the riots, but the protests who are saying the criminal justice system needs to change?
Absolutely. I think there's some justification. There's no doubt that there are some concerning adverse outcomes as it relates to the justice system in regards to certain demographics in our country. That's what the statistics say. That's what the anecdotal testimony says. So, and now how we get there and why it's like it is, there's a lot of commentary about it, but there's no doubt, sir, that there are just some adverse outcomes for American blacks and other minorities when it comes to the criminal justice system, and we need to do whatever we need to fix it.
My guest for this hour is Texas State Representative James White. He represents several counties in the southeast part of the state, right?
Yes.
We're talking about criminal justice issues. You can find out more about him by going to pointofview.net. Pointofview.net, we've got his biography up there. We've got a link to him and so forth. So if you'd like to find out more about Representative White, you can go to pointofview.net and find out some of the information about him, the committees he's on, and what he's doing, and his background. So when we come back, we're going to continue to discuss this, and we'll move on to the protest movements and even the riots and what we need to be doing about that. We'll be back in just a minute.
A couple of weeks ago, Point of View and you were presented with a challenge. It was a welcome challenge, but a challenge nonetheless. Nearing the end of our fiscal year and trying hard to make sure we're fully prepared to be a voice of truth and reason in the second half of the year, one friend of Point of View stepped up and said he would donate $50,000 if other listeners would match it. And as we were trying to finish up that rush challenge, we got another call and another $50,000 gift to match by July 15th, today. Well, we're extremely thankful to say it looks like we made it. Because of you, we were able to match not just one, but both $50,000 challenges. And I assure you, that's critically important as we move into the late summer and fall of 2020. We need the truth as we continue facing the threat of COVID-19 and as the presidential election season finally gets into high gear. We are so much better prepared for these challenges because of your sacrifices on behalf of the Truth Team. So from Kirby and the entire team in Dallas, we thank God for you. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back to Point of View. This is Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and on the phone with me, Texas State Representative James White. If you'd like to call and ask Representative White a question, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212, and we'll open those lines and you can talk to him directly. Representative White, in Texas, we had some of the protests as they did in, I guess, just about every state, and some of them in larger cities, some of them in smaller cities in the states. There were a few places. Dallas had some. They had a couple of rough nights, but we didn't. We just did not go into flames like Minneapolis and some of the other cities did. And Washington D.C. is still struggling with things, and New York City especially. What's the difference? Why? I think I'm saying that the protests, they were more protests, fewer riots, and less disruptions in Texas. Is that just because of our police departments are going to control this a little more? Just what was the difference between us and some of the other cities?
Well, let's just put it on the table. In a lot of these cities where you had a lot of this violent rioting and destruction of property, let's take it another step too. A lot of these places where there are these gross injustices being carried out by the police department, these are locales that have been governed by Democrats for years. They own the city council. They've owned the mayoralty for decades. They get to pick who's going to be the police chief. They negotiate all of the civil service guidelines in the police contract. They fund these departments. So I think in many instances, again, people don't want to say it, but I will say it, a lot of what you see going on in these other cities is a result of decades and decades of poor leftist governance.
And, you know, it's interesting because they've even come out to sort of defend that in some sense. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a representative to the House from New York, has a Twitter video out there where she's saying, well, what would have caused this? Well, they're poor, people have been out of work and other things of that nature. And she implied that, well, they have families to feed and they're broke and haven't been able to work, so they're going and taking bread. And as I watch some of these videos, those big screen televisions were not bread. The liquor bottles were not bread. They were going in and clearing out stores and then setting fire to them. Even if you wanted to make the case that somebody broke into a bakery and took some food, or a grocery store and took some meat or some things of that nature, why would you set fire to the things after they did? And they did that in so many of these cities.
Yeah, and let me say this: the people of the people of lesser means that I know, especially ones in my district, and I would say I represent a very conservative district, but a district that's predominantly hard working class people. These are some of the most virtuous and upstanding people in our country. Being poor is not somehow a signal or attracts people to do more crime. So I just have to really disagree with the Congresswoman on that point.
You know, I can't remember. I think it was Walter Williams, may have been Thomas Sowell, both two great black economists. And I think it was Walter Williams one time who mentioned, I was listening to him, talking to him, and he said, you know, when I was young, we lived in a community and we were all poor as dirt. Nobody had anything. He said, there was no crime. We didn't lock the doors in the evening. We just left the doors open because the notion that poor and crime necessarily go together is that just didn't happen in their communities. And he's just sort of highlighting some of the changes that we've seen these days. And I think there's some truth in that.
Yes, it's very much so. But this is what we don't know also is some truth in it, is that what we are seeing in many of these locales with this violence and whatnot, and they're trying to frame this as, some, new civil rights movement. If you really think about the real true civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s, that was a church faith-based movement.
Mm-hmm.
It started in black churches, and then we had white clergy, men and women, that joined it. What concerns me about this current state of protest, and more importantly, the violence, is that I don't see that faith-based component that's been involved in every era of transformation of this country. And I think, again, this growth of secularism, if anything, it's the growth of secularism, the lack of faith, not necessarily the lack of resources, personal resources, that are contributing to a lot of the maladies in these locales throughout the country.
It's a very good point. And one of the strangest things to come out of these, which I would have never guessed, is the defund the police movement that has gotten some legs in some cities out there. New York has ended its plainclothesmen. They've reassigned those, and they're shuffling money around. Minneapolis has voted, I believe, the city council to essentially defund the police. And then of all the hypocrisy and irony, after the city council did that, as I understand from the news, they hired private security to escort them away because they needed security, and they just voted to defund the police, and yet using private security to protect them.
Yes, usual leftist hypocrisy. And I think we're seeing in all of these places where you have a mayor, like in New York City, instead of sitting down with local law enforcement, coming up with constructive ways to maintain safe communities, instead, he's more interested in painting a roadway in front of the president's real estate properties. And we're seeing that these locales are encouraging and experiencing increases in violent crime.
Yes.
Which is really the crime that they said that they were wanting these law enforcement people to focus on, and that's why they were rearranging and defunding the police. We don't need to defund the police. We know from time to time, and look, I'm a member of the legislature, right? And I'm an appropriator. And we know from time to time you make decisions about appropriating, different agencies and moving money around. But we don't need to defund the police. The unfortunate situation or situations that have happened throughout our country is not due to police funding. It's due to poor leftist governance in these Democrat-dominated city halls, city councils, police departments, and state legislatures, because they're the ones in charge.
President Trump made the point back in his first campaign to African Americans, why don't you vote for me? You've been voting for Democrats for years, especially in the cities and so forth, and you have nothing to show for it. When Baltimore had its issues, he pointed out the problems of the city, and that they still remain in Baltimore. And it's amazing to me that you don't see more. I think you've seen some turning, but that you don't see more turning, saying President Trump's right. Voting for Democrats for the last 50 or 60 years simply has not improved our lives. Maybe it's time to try something different. Yes.
And look, we're very proud to serve on one of the president's national reelection committees, Black Voices for Trump. Out in my part of Texas, we are strong Trump supporters. We think he's been good for Texas. He's been good for this country, and he's been good for Black people as well. During this presidency, American blacks have experienced historical lows in unemployment. He has done just phenomenal things in institutionalizing the resourcing of historically Black universities, like the one that I graduated from here in Texas, Prairie View A&M University.
Mm-hmm.
He's just done so much, and then with setting the standards, setting an example of getting behind the First Act, the First Step Act. So these are the issues that are important to American blacks. Reforming the criminal justice system, check. Donald Trump. Ensuring that American blacks have opportunity to get jobs and start businesses and not having to compete against illegal, undocumented labor. A check. Respecting and honoring long-serving, positive black institutions, the black church, historically black colleges and universities. Check. Donald Trump. This guy has been a great president and will continue to be when he's reelected for American Black.
Our guest this hour is Representative James White from Texas. When we come back after the break, I'd like to talk to you, Representative White, about the Texas's response to the pandemic. Are we doing it about right? And what may need to be done when the legislature comes back in January. So stay with us. We'll be back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to our final segment with Representative James White of Texas. Representative, every state has been struggling through this pandemic. In my opinion, Governor Greg Abbott has done a very, very good job. He's gotten a lot of criticism from the right and a lot of criticism from the left. But given the fact of how much we don't know and how much things change, I mean, the experts in January, February were telling us you don't need masks. I even heard some, sort of mocking the notion, why would you wear a mask? It doesn't help you. It doesn't help the other person. Now everybody has to wear a mask. There was a time when they said they're going in and sterilizing everything in a restaurant or a store, and turns out later on they said, well, it probably doesn't transfer very easily by just touching something on top of a desk or something of that nature. It probably has to come through the air as being the most likely way that you're going to catch it. There's been a lot of shifting information, and Governor Abbott has been, I think, just very accessible on the television, regularly answering reporters' questions, trying to express what he's doing, and trying to move us forward as much as possible, given how much we don't know. What are your assessments of Governor Abbott's response?
Look, the governor, I think his approach to this, especially in the beginning, will be studied by many experts that look at the issue of disasters and responding to emergencies. If you think, the level of hospital beds that we've been able to get staffed up over the last several months so quickly, the millions and millions of articles of PPE that the governor and his team has been able to acquire for Texans and to help out our schools when we had so many manufacturing deficiencies that was hampering that effort back in February and March. His ability to ensure that we had the ventilator capacity that we have now. And all that was due to decisions that the governor made really early and taking advantage of that period of time where we were in the lockdown in March and April. So that was done extremely, extremely well. And again, that will go down as a textbook response.
Well, and Governor Cuomo of New York is likely to go down as a textbook response of how not to respond with nursing homes. Yeah. And Governor Gavin Newsom of California and the state spent nearly $1 billion buying N95 masks that turned out to be fraudulent. They weren't FDA. They didn't meet FDA standards. And you look at some of the things, and these are very pro big government states where they've made some major mistakes. And it's not to say the government may not have made some mistakes, but you give people a little bit of wiggle room, flexibility when there's so much going on and so many experts are giving you different information. What's going to happen in the schools in your district? They're in Texas, they're trying to decide, well, we want them to coming back in, but maybe we'll give them some flexibility. Some school districts are postponing the opening for a couple of weeks. What's happening in your district?
Hey, thank you for asking that question and framing it in my district. Because our local public schools, the key word there is more so local than public. I am so proud of my education community in Southeast Texas, and I just have to brag on them a little bit, and I'll be real quick with this, Merrill. But they have the way they responded initially to this pandemic. Overnight, they set up hundreds of feeding stations for our children so they could continue to get nourished. The teachers went to work immediately and diligently and came up with remote learning opportunities for our kids. And they did this with a lot of unity and not a lot of murmuring and complaining. I am just so absolutely proud. And this will go down as one of the shining moments in the annals of Texas public education. And there's a lot of them, but this one will go down as a great one. Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir. And so here in Southeast Texas, for several months now, my superintendents and working with their school boards and their administrative teams, they have been planning for this eventuality to going back to school, as far as making sure that they have the ability to accommodate those parents that would rather keep their kids at home, while at the same time making sure that anything on campus is responsible and safe.
The pandemic and the lockdown has hurt state revenues. You're going back. You're going to go back next year with a smaller budget than you had. How are you going to address some of the spending needs when the state is not going to have as much money as you had anticipated just coming back?
Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we can't get into another lockdown. Okay, and the only way we're going to do that is to individually do these precautions that the governor's talked about and other health experts have talked about. So if you're going around a group of vulnerable, at-risk COVID folks, consider wearing a face mask. Consider standing at least 6 feet away from them. All of that, because we've got to get our industry back together to mitigate some of that revenue shortfall, Merrill. Then from there, I'm looking forward to doing what I had to do in 2011. We had to look at what are the true core government functions that the people expect. They expect safe communities. They expect our kids to get educated, and then they expect those populations that are the most vulnerable in society to be able to get the health care that they need. So we'll focus on those primarily and make sure that we're helping the people that we should be helping and maintaining safe communities. And then we'll just have to make some tough budget decisions. I think we could also look at how can we transform or reform our tax code, where you could probably get some opportunities to lower tax rates, while at the same time, some of these outdated, tax rebates and tax considerations that we've had for 80 and 90 years that are not really important now, you could get rid of those, lower the rate, and actually at the same time bring in more revenue.
The state has a pretty healthy, at least has had a pretty healthy rainy day fund that y'all have been very reluctant to use over the years. Is it time to draw on the rainy day fund?
Oh, gosh, it's past time. And let me just put a footnote on that. Every session that I've served in and every budget that I've voted for in the Texas legislature has used rainy day funds, okay? And we will do it again. But I need to be honest with folks. The potential shortfall that we are looking at, the $8.5 billion that's possibly projected to be in the rainy day fund by the time we return to the Capitol, would not even get close to closing the gap. So that's why the governor has asked, Lieutenant Governor Speaker has asked agencies to start looking at a 5% cut now. Okay, to kind of mitigate that gap, but we will use a robust portion from the rainy day fund, but that would not close the gap that we're probably expecting.
And just quickly, what do you expect the gap to be?
Well, gosh, when I came in 2011, the gap was about $15 billion in general revenue and a total of $27 billion in all funds. Mm. So it probably be definitely more than a $27 billion, right? No. But look, here's the deal. The point is, how do we get our economy back up and humming strong so we can start bringing those revenues in? And even, I remember back in 2011, Merrill, going through that tough budget cycle, the Texas economy was actually growing and recovering.
We got to stop it there, Representative. Thank you so much for joining us. That was Representative James White from Texas, representative to the House of in Texas, and we'll be back in just a minute.
A couple of weeks ago, Point of View and you were presented with a challenge. It was a welcome challenge, but a challenge nonetheless. Nearing the end of our fiscal year and trying hard to make sure we're fully prepared to be a voice of truth and reason in the second half of the year, one friend of Point of View stepped up and said he would donate $50,000 if other listeners would match it. And as we were trying to finish up that rush challenge, we got another call and another $50,000 gift to match by July 15th, today. Well, we're extremely thankful to say it looks like we made it. Because of you, we were able to match not just one, but both $50,000 challenges. And I assure you, that's critically important as we move into the late summer and fall of 2020. We need the truth as we continue facing the threat of COVID-19 and as the presidential election season finally gets into high gear. We are so much better prepared for these challenges because of your sacrifices on behalf of the Truth Team. So from Kirby and the entire team in Dallas, we thank God for you. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome to Point of View. This is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And we've got an exciting hour for you this hour and next hour. We're going to start out in the first segment talking to Sidney Powell. She's a friend who is representing retired General Michael Flynn. She has taken that case and turned it around. In the next segment, we're going to talk a little bit about Barry Weiss, the former New York Times editorial page editor who resigned a couple of days ago in a very public manner. We'll also talk to Tom Giovanetti about social networks and censorship. And then the next hour, we're going to talk to Michael Schellenberger, a former environmental activist who came to the conclusion that the environmental movement was causing more harm than it was doing good. He's still an environmentalist, but he has pointed out some of the problems that a lot of us have been saying for some time. But let's start out now by going to Sidney Powell. Sidney, are you with us?
I am. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for joining us. Sydney and I were talking, 10 days ago or so, and she was going to be on the show. And then she got notice from the D.C. Court of Appeals that she needed to respond to the request for moving her case with Michael Flynn from being a 3-judge panel to the full D.C. Court of Appeals. So she's actually gotten much busier here in the last few days having to write that response. Sidney, take just a minute to tell us where we are on the Michael Flynn case.
Well, the District of Columbia, the Circuit Court for the District of Columbia, entered what's called an extraordinary writ or writ of mandamus to tell Judge Sullivan he had to grant the government's motion to dismiss the case against General Flynn. There are a number of reasons for that, and most of them are constitutional. But Judge Sullivan didn't do that. Instead, he waited 15 days and then filed a petition for rehearing, asking the whole court to look at the issue. He doesn't have standing to do that. The judge is not supposed to have a dog in this fight, so he shouldn't even be allowed to file a petition for rehearing. But he did, and because the court could grant rehearing on its own, we certainly have to address the actual arguments he makes in it. So we are filing an opposition to that by Monday. And I believe the government will probably file in response to it also.
And this is all an issue. This is all an issue because the Department of Justice has dropped its case against General Flynn and said there were things done wrong there. We don't really have a case. We don't think a crime was committed, and they're pulling their case. And yet Judge Sullivan won't let that happen. It seems like.
Well, absolutely not. He's gotten more vehement by the minute in opposing the government's motion to dismiss. It's absolutely stunning because a judge is supposed to be a neutral arbiter, not a litigator or cast aside his robe and join the former prosecution. It's really quite stunning what's been happening in this case.
Now, you were at the Department. Oh, go ahead.
We're optimistic that the Court of Appeals as a whole will recognize the importance of this issue to the rule of law writ large and deny the petition for rehearing.
Now,
it's absolutely unprecedented.
You were at the Justice Department for 10 years. Then you spent 20 years in private practice where you were representing people before various appeals courts. And you wrote a book, which I'm going to show it to the audience here. You wrote a book, License to Lie, Exposing Corruption in the Department of Justice. You wrote this back and it came out in 2014, sort of reflecting your experience at the Department of Justice. That was 6 years ago, and you came out and you sort of identified the deep state in the Justice Department before anybody ever knew that was a term. But when you mentioned to some of us that you were taking on the Flynn case, I think some of us are like, well, it's the Lord's work, but good luck with that. But you have actually turned this thing around. And what's interesting to me in the introduction to the book, in the foreword, by a judge from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, he mentions a situation back with Ted Stevens, which you highlight. That's former Alaska Senator Ted Stevens, who was prosecuted by the Justice Department for various actions. And the judge in that case was Emmett Sullivan, same judge that you're in front of, I believe. And in that particular case, the judge is saying the Justice Department made up these allegations. They weren't true. He wasn't given a fair hearing and so forth. And he's taking exactly the opposite position, it seems to me, of what he's doing now. You can't make this stuff up.
No, you can't. I mean, it's been absolutely stunning to me. I mean, I thought all along that I would win coming in because Judge Sullivan would be the one judge in the country who could see the government misconduct and hiding all the evidence that showed General Flynn was innocent. And I knew it was being hidden because I knew he was innocent. And instead, Judge Sullivan's on his own crusade to convict him. I mean, it's just been unbelievable.
Take just a couple of minutes to mention what you found at the Justice Department that you highlight in your book, License to Lie.
Well, the lead villain in the book is Andrew Weissman, who was head of the Enron task force at the time, and he, along with a number of other people, made up crimes against people by piecing together parts of different statutes. They destroyed Arthur Anderson and 85,000 jobs, only to be reversed by a unanimous Supreme Court 2.5 years later because there was no crime committed by Anderson, among other things. And they also sent 4 innocent Merrill Lynch executives to prison for up to a year on an indictment that made an honest business transaction sound criminal. And that got reversed. 12 out of 14 counts of it did. We, of course, tried to file bar grievances against these lawyers because they had hidden the evidence that showed they were innocent while they made up the crimes. But those got nowhere, and I felt like I just had to try to warn the public about what was going on in our criminal justice system.
And
that's why I wrote License to Lie.
You were even warning us in the Mueller report before the Mueller report came out. You raised, at least in front of me, some concerns about the report that I think, in retrospect, came out to be generally correct.
Oh yes, I knew it was going to be just an appalling collection of things that weren't justified by the actual truth, because Andrew Weissman wouldn't know the truth if it bit off his nose.
And how do we clean up the Justice Department? Give us 30 seconds. What do we have to do there?
Well, one thing I think we're going to have to do is abolish absolute immunity that prosecutors enjoy, because when they commit intentional misconduct, they should be held accountable for that in every way possible. And prosecutors who violate the rule that requires them to produce exculpatory evidence to the defense should be fired immediately, and provisions have to be made for that to be done.
Is Attorney General Barr doing a good job in your opinion?
I think he's doing a great job so far, as best I can tell. There are too many limits, I think, probably on his ability to hold prosecutors accountable, at least in the inside system of the Office of Professional Responsibility and whatever the protections are for government employees. I think government employees in general enjoy far too many protections. I don't think they should be any more privileged to keep their job than anybody in the outside world is.
If you want to find out more about Sidney Powell and her work, you can go to Point of View's website, pointofview.net. We have a link to her and her information there, and about her book, License to Lie, which is still in print, and the copies of that are available. Sidney, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Bye.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, in the midst of the debates about which lives matter is a more important question as to why lives matter at all. This is not a commentary about Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. This is a more fundamental question. If you start with an evolutionary view that all life is a result of chance, then on what basis can you argue that any life is more important than any other? One of the guests on my radio program argues that if you accept naturalistic Darwinism, then no lives matter. So in the midst of this debate and discussion, you would hope that Americans living in a society influenced by Judeo-Christian values might have a better answer. But that is not what George Barna has found in his latest survey through the Cultural Research Center. He concluded that less than 4 in 10 of Americans today view human life as having unconditional intrinsic worth. Most of these people are found in the deeply religious segments of society. You know, as you might expect, an evolutionary view surfaced in the research. 1 out of 8 claimed that people are merely material substance or biological machines. Even more interesting was the fact that another 1/8 argued that people are part of the mind of the universe. Some people even argue that humans are an illusion, and others said that we're a sleeping god, part of the soul of the universe. A substantial share of the population combined to offer views such as life is what you make it, but it has no absolute value, and life does not attain its full value until we reach our highest point of evolution and expression. All of this suggests that the best question to ask is why any life matters and on what basis. Americans obviously have some very confused ideas about this. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. We just had Sidney Powell on. She is the attorney representing Michael Flynn in his case, trying to get him cleared. And it is an amazing story. Sidney was going to be with us the whole hour. We were talking about that, 10 days ago or so. And then when I saw that the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals gave her 10 days or so to respond to Judge Sullivan's request to have the whole D.C. Circuit hear the case on Michael Flynn rather than just the 3-judge panel, which sided in Michael Flynn's favor. I knew she was going to be time constrained because she's got to write another brief for the court to explain why this doesn't need to be going forward. But it's an amazing story. Sidney was talking to us back a year or so ago when she was raising concerns about the Mueller report and the Mueller team. And I thought at the time, a lot of things had not come out yet. And I wondered, you either know something or you're speculating. And apparently she knew something. She's been involved in this for some time. So we'll hope to have her back for a whole hour once Michael Flynn gets this thing tossed out, assuming that's what happens. But she has really taken a case that people thought was generally lost and turned it around. The other amazing thing we've had happen this week is a couple of days ago, Barry Weiss, the op-ed page editor of the New York Times, who was brought in 3 years ago. She says to sort of make the newspaper inclusive, bringing in different viewpoints and so forth. And what she was doing was responding. What the New York Times was trying to do was what a number of papers have done. Typically, newspapers get a lot of liberal-oriented, left-leaning submissions to their op-ed pages. Oftentimes the editorial board is on the left, and they feel like they did not cover and provide enough voice for those who were on the conservative side or Trump supporters and others. So a number of editorial pages said we need to make sure that we're getting those voices out there. 3 years ago, the New York Times brought in Barry Weiss to do that. My guess is she's probably generally a centrist on things, but she was wanted to try to bring in various new voices, new opinions, and other things that are happening. And she resigned 2 days ago very publicly and very critical of the New York Times. Now, we have a link to that, to her resignation letter on our website at pointofview.net. So you can go and download it and read it there. But it's very telling as she goes in to explain to them what she thinks some of the problems were. She mentions a number of the people that she was able to give op-ed space to in the New York Times. But she says the lessons that ought to have been that followed the elections, lessons about the importance of understanding other Americans, the necessity of resisting tribalism, and the centrality of the free exchange of ideas to democratic society have not been learned at the New York Times. Instead, a new consensus has emerged in the press, but perhaps especially at this paper, that truth isn't a process of collective discovery, but an orthodoxy already known by an enlightened few whose job is to inform everyone else. Twitter is not on the masthead of the New York Times, but Twitter has become its ultimate editor. As the ethics and mores of the platform have become more those of the paper itself has increasingly become a kind of performance space. Stories are chosen and told in a way to satisfy the narrowest of audiences, rather than to allow a curious public to read about the world and then draw their own conclusions. I was always taught that journalists were charged with writing the first rough draft of history. Now, history itself is one more ephemeral thing molded to fit the needs of a predetermined narrative. Now, you know, we've been talking about this for some time here on Point of View, that what has happened to the media has changed in a fundamental way, where at least even though the mainstream media used to be on the left, liberal leaning, they tried to create some kind of balance there, both in their reporting and in the editorial pages, and that has changed over the last, it's been changing for a while, but really took off with Donald Trump. And Barry Weiss is giving voice to that. She goes on to say, my own forays into wrong-think, that sounds like a George Orwell word, have made me the subject of constant bullying by colleagues who disagree with my views. Excuse me, they have called me a Nazi and a racist. I have learned to brush off comments about how I'm writing for the Jews again. Several colleagues perceived to be friendly with me were badgered by co-workers. My work and my character were openly demeaned by company-wide Slack channels that were masthead editors regularly weigh in. There, some co-workers insist I need to be rooted out of this company if it is to truly be an inclusive one. With others, while others post emojis next to my name, still other New York Times employees publicly smear me as a liar and a bigot on Twitter, with no fear that harassing me will be met with the appropriate action. They never are. There are terms for all of this unlawful discrimination, hostile work environment, constructive discharge. I'm no legal expert, but I know that this is wrong. I do not understand how you have allowed this kind of behavior, she's talking to the editors, how you allow this kind of behavior to go on inside your company in full view of the paper's entire staff and the public. And I certainly can't square how you and other Times leaders have stood by while simultaneously praising me in private for my courage. Showing up for work as a centrist at an American newspaper should not be an act of bravery. Part of me wishes I could say that my experience was unique, but the truth is that intellectual curiosity, let alone risk-taking, is now a liability at the Times. Why edit something challenging to our readers or write something bold only to go through the numbing process of making it ideologically kosher when we can assure ourselves of job security and clicks by publishing our 400,000th op-ed arguing Donald Trump is a unique danger to the country and the world. And so self-censorship has become the norm. We've been saying this for some time, that the newspapers have increasingly moved to this type of self-censorship where the reporters are increasingly putting pressure upon both the editor and the opinion section. And the opinion section is supposed to be separate from the news. So the opinion section of a newspaper, where it has the unsigned editorials and the opinion pieces, that may reflect the ideas of the publisher or the owner of the paper, but the news is supposed to be independent, nonpartisan, fair, and balanced. Increasingly, the reporters are none of that. And I look through some of these articles and I say, they're not being balanced. They go to the same liberal sources for comments. They don't go to conservative sources many times. And they're increasingly the editorial pages are increasingly becoming part of the news coverage rather than the editorial page as reporters increasingly just infiltrate their own thinking and criticism of anybody who doesn't agree with them. And this is what's happening at the newspapers. One of the reasons the internet and other force has been a challenge for newspapers, but increasingly newspapers are becoming irrelevant to many Americans because they have become so ideologically fixed on the left. And Barry Weiss is trying to give a voice to that, and why she is trying to decide to step down. It wasn't just a month ago or so that the New York Times published an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton about whether or not it's justified. It's justified to bring the military, National Guard or something, into some of these protest areas if the police cannot handle it. The New York Times ran that op-ed. Senator Cotton said they asked for that. Once it was published, there was such a backlash at the New York Times that it essentially renounced their op-ed that they had published. They apologized for it, and the editorial page editor stepped down because of it. So it's amazing things that we're seeing out here in the press these days. Donald Trump sort of highlighted that when he came out and started talking about fake news. I think a lot of us wanted to believe that the news was still trying to be impartial at the time, the news being the mainstream media. We simply can't do that anymore. It is not impartial. And what's happening now is Barry Weiss is giving voice to something we have been pointing to for some time, and especially at the New York Times, which is supposed to be the paper of record for the country. So we'll see what reactions come from this, but it's a very bold step by her in calling out the New York Times and the media in general. When we come back from the break, we're going to move to Tom Giovanetti of the Institute for Policy Innovation to talk about some of the major media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Google, and what they are doing. Are they censoring conservatives? Is it appropriate? And are there laws against it? We'll be back in a minute.
A couple of weeks ago, Point of View and you were presented with a challenge. It was a welcome challenge, but a challenge nonetheless. Nearing the end of our fiscal year and trying hard to make sure we're fully prepared to be a voice of truth and reason in the second half of the year, one friend of Point of View stepped up and said he would donate $50,000 if other listeners would match it. And as we were trying to finish up that rush challenge, we got another call and another $50,000 gift to match by July 15th, today. Well, we're extremely thankful to say it looks like we made it. Because of you, we were able to match not just one, but both $50,000 challenges. And I assure you, that's critically important as we move into the late summer and fall of 2020. We need the truth as we continue facing the threat of COVID-19 and as the presidential election season finally gets into high gear. We are so much better prepared for these challenges because of your sacrifices on behalf of the Truth Team. So from Kirby and the entire team in Dallas, we thank God for you. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And we're going to switch gears now as we turn to look at social media platforms and the controversy that has been swirling around those for a little while now. It's a growing controversy. Laws are being proposed to address it. To discuss this is someone who has written on this and knows this very well. Tom Giovanetti, president of the Institute for Policy Innovation, is with me. Tom, are you there on the phone?
I'm here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. So you and I have talked about this issue some, and what's going on is you've got these major social media platforms that so many people turn to. We're talking about Facebook, Google, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, a range of them, and there are growing concerns, especially among the conservative movement, that those platforms are editing or censoring them and infringing upon their free speech rights. They're becoming sort of editors and making content decisions, and it has raised this question about what we call Section 230. So give the listeners a little bit of background about what Section 230 is and what it means.
Sure, thank you. And again, thanks for having me on, because this is a topic that has got a lot of people worked up right now. There's a lot of proposed regulations and legislation floating around. And the problem is, I think a lot of folks don't understand the background of all of this. And you really should understand the background of a law or a piece of legislation before you try to change it. There's a famous G.K. Chesterton, the famous Christian writer, made the point that before you try to tear down a fence, you should look and see why the fence was put up in the first place. And so I think this is a good example of that. So back before there was any such thing as social media, back before there was such a thing as Facebook or Twitter, there was a piece of legislation passed called the Communications Decency Act, or the CDA. And the CDA was intended to let Internet platforms police themselves. This was back in the days of bulletin boards and CompuServe and Prodigy and things like that.
1996, so 24 years ago.
That's exactly right. So this predates all of the social media tools that we're talking about right now. And the problem back then was that these were platforms where really anybody could log in and could post content, and some of that content was objectionable. I mean, some of it was obscene, some of it was child pornography, and some of it was threats of violence and things like that. And the problem that the people who were hosting these platforms had is they said it's not right that we be held legally liable if some crazy person comes and posts something terrible on our platform. And so there was a piece of legislation that was passed called the Communications Decency Act. And the whole purpose of that legislation was to clean up the Internet. And it was to facilitate the cleaning up of the Internet, to make it possible for people who host these kinds of sites to block objectionable content and do away with it. And Section 230 was a part of the Communications Decency Act. So the CDA went before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court threw out almost all of the Communications Decency Act as a violation of the First Amendment. The only part of it that survived was Section 230. The Supreme Court said that there's nothing about Section 230 that's unconstitutional or that violates other laws. So Section 230 is the only part of the Communications Decency Act that survived, but we have to remember that the reason there is a Section 230 was specifically designed to allow websites to police themselves, was to give them the power to do that. So you fast forward now, and then you have these platforms that have a ton of user-generated content, like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, Instagram, Snapchat, all these kinds of platforms. And these platforms primarily exist for user-generated content. And so the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act still applies to those platforms, and it gives them the power to police themselves. It gives them the power to block content, to delete content, to take it down, to block accounts and things like that. It gives them the power to do that, and it shields them from legal liability in case some user posts something that's legal or objectionable and they're not able to filter it out. Now, if it weren't for that protection, if it weren't for Section 230, you never would have had a Facebook or a Twitter or a Reddit or a YouTube or anything like that. Now, I will grant that there are folks out there, the audience, who probably think the world might be a better place if there had never been a Twitter or a Facebook or a YouTube. But on the other hand, these platforms have actually proven themselves to be of tremendous social good, especially in this incredible pandemic time when people are not able to meet. They're not able to socialize like they normally are. Social media has allowed people to stay in contact. Twitter has obviously become an important platform for communication of news and things like that. President Trump has many, many, many millions of followers on Twitter. It's his primary way of getting out his thoughts and opinions on things. So it's hard to argue that these platforms have been completely terrible and completely bad. They seem to have developed a lot of benefit. But what people, everyone out there seems to feel like they are being disadvantaged on these platforms. Conservatives feel that they're being discriminated against on Twitter. Ironically, the left and the progressives feel that they're being discriminated against on Facebook. And, when you actually look at statistics of this sort of stuff, there's not a lot of good evidence that there is one-sided bias on any of these platforms. You have a lot of conservatives who feel like Twitter has been discriminating against conservatives, but there are leftists and progressives who have also been blocked and had things taken down. There's a very interesting thing that's going on right now. There's a technology reporter at the New York Times who is tracking every single day the top 10 most heavily trafficked posts on Facebook. And most days, all 10 of those, or 9 out of 10, or 8 out of 10 of those are conservative sourced. So the idea somehow that social media is just tilted against conservatives or tilted against Republicans is probably not true. But no one's perfect, and these platforms are not perfect. So you certainly do have cases where things are blocked that probably should not have been blocked. Accounts are suspended that probably should not have been suspended. And so what a lot of folks out there want to do is implement some sort of regulations or pass some sort of a law that obligates these platforms to what might be called a free speech obligation or a First Amendment obligation. Now, the reason people are proposing that is that these platforms right now do not have a First Amendment obligation. Remember, the First Amendment protects us against the government stifling our speech. It doesn't protect us against private entities stifling our speech. You don't have a right to say whatever you want to on Facebook or Twitter, just like you don't have a right to say whatever you want to at Walmart. I mean, if you were to walk into Walmart and set up a step stool and start spouting off and giving a hot political speech, they would hustle you out of Walmart because you don't have a right to free speech in the aisles of Walmart. You have a right for the government to not stifle your speech, but you don't have an active right to free speech in a private venue. And Twitter and Facebook and Reddit and things like that are private venues. So you get into this very interesting tension between the perception that people have that they have a right to free speech on these platforms, but actually technically under the law and Constitution, these platforms do not have any kind of a free speech right. They have the legal ability to police their platforms and to block speech that they feel is harmful or threatening or the kind of speech that would make their platforms an undesirable place to be.
Now, my understanding of the concern is that these groups initially said you're going to be platforms, neutral platforms, and not imposing editorial content. You're just a neutral platform, though you can take down certain things like child pornography or things of that nature, hate speech. But now you're starting to make decisions with regard to conservative speech or liberal speech or something. So you're actually acting like an editor as opposed to a neutral platform, and therefore you're no longer operating appropriately under the Section 230. Do I understand that concern right, or the argument?
That is exactly the issue that exists right now. It's this distinction that Section 230 makes between platforms and publishers. But again, we have to remember the Section 230 was written before there was such a thing as social media. So a better way to think about the intentions of Section 230 is to not think about social media. It's to think about a different kind of website. So let's think about a website like the New York Times website or like the Hill website where you are often published.
Tom, hold that thought for a second. We're going to take a break in just a second, and then we'll come back and let you carry on with that. My guest for this 30 minutes, Tom Giovanetti, president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. There's information about Tom and IPI on our website at pointofview.net. You can go there and look, or you can go to ipi.org. That website is available for scrutiny and to look at the information, share it, read it, whatever you want to do. So stay with us. We'll be back in just a second.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back with our final segment with Tom Giovanetti from the Institute for Policy Innovation, IPI.org. And Tom, before we took the break, we were talking about this distinction between the social media platforms, groups like Facebook, Google, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, Snapchat, Instagram, that they were platforms, but some people, and I hear this from some conservative friends, argue that they're increasingly acting like a publisher, which sort of takes them away from the Section 230. So what's your response to that?
Sure. Well, this is a difference between what the law says and what some people would like the law to say. So as I said earlier before the commercial break, you're exactly right that this is the key distinction, this distinction between platforms and publishers. So a good way to think about that is to take the example of The Hill, which is a Capitol Hill website and newspaper where you are very often published. Mm-hmm. So when you send The Hill an op-ed, they make a decision about whether or not to run your op-ed. And they may even insist on certain edits to your op-ed before it would be run. So in that way, they are acting like a publisher. And so if they accepted an op-ed from you where you engaged in some sort of libel or slander against someone, then the Hill would be legally liable for that because they chose to publish your piece, and they have the responsibility as a publisher. But on the other hand, when you run a piece on the Hill, there are many times hundreds or even thousands of comments that run underneath your piece, and that's user-generated content. And so even right there on the same website and even right there on the same article, you have this distinction between publisher and platform. So the Hill is legally responsible for what they publish, what they choose to publish, like your op-ed. But Section 230 says they are not legally responsible for the comments that people post below your piece because that's user-generated content. So that's the best example that I can give you of the difference between the obligation of a publisher and the protection that Section 230 gives to websites for user-generated content. Now, when you switch over to Facebook and Twitter, that's 100% user-generated comments. I mean, Facebook and Twitter are like the comment section from the Hill. It's all material that other people have published. And so what Section 230 does for Twitter and Facebook is it says you're not legally liable for this because this is user-generated content. But anytime Twitter and Facebook do act as a publisher, they're still legally liable. So if Facebook posts something on Facebook, if it actually comes officially from Facebook, and there's something in there that's legally problematic, they would not be immune from legal liability for that, because if they publish it themselves, they are acting as a publisher. But by allowing user-generated content, you're not acting as a publisher. And again, so what Section 230 does is it gives them the right to go into that user-generated content and delete material that they consider to be objectionable. Now, the folks like Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri and a few other conservative politicians, what they're arguing is you should have the same publisher obligations if you're going to go into that user-generated content. And if you're going to filter or you're going to delete certain comments, you're going to block certain content, what Josh Hawley asserts is you are then acting as a publisher. Now, what Section 230 says is no, you're not. So what Josh Hawley is saying, and what those who are calling for changes in regulations are saying, is that we need to essentially redefine what it means to be a publisher under Section 230. And we need to go ahead and say that if you're going to edit, essentially, this user-generated content, that makes you a publisher. Now, the thing that people need to understand is if we make that change, if we do what Josh Hawley wants us to do, if we say that any Internet platform that edits user-generated content automatically becomes a publisher, there's one of two things that are going to happen. Either, number one, these websites are going to simply block all user-generated content. So, like, let's go back to the Hill again. They would probably immediately shut off their comment section because why have that legal liability for user-generated content if you don't have to? So one possible outcome of that would just be the end of user-generated content. But the opposite extreme is also possible. If Josh Hawley got his way and Twitter suddenly became legally liable if they edited their user-generated content, what they might choose to do is stop editing their user-generated content, as they might just start saying, okay, we're not going to block anything. And unfortunately, given what we know about human nature and given what we know about the Internet, what that means is that those platforms would suddenly become thick with pornography, child pornography, threats of violence, copyright violations, just all sorts of things would start going on those platforms that are today blocked. Google will tell you when they show you like their top list of like top 10 or top 20 search terms, they'll tell you, of course, what we're ignoring here is all the search terms for pornography and things like that. If Google were to show you the raw data as far as the most popular searches go, almost all of the top most popular searches would be for objectionable content. And it's unfortunate. That's an unfortunate statement about human nature. But we have to understand that if we tell these platforms that they're no longer able to edit and they're no longer able to block, what we're going to find out is that we don't like very much this new Wild West of an internet that we will end up with.
And companies are, because these are private sector companies, they have the freedom to do that. As you point out, the First Amendment covers the government imposing restrictions, not a private sector business doing that.
And that's why I brought up at the very beginning of this discussion that the origin of Section 230 was the Communications Decency Act. The whole purpose of this legal structure that we have was to keep the internet from becoming a cesspool. And it was to create a legal device, a legal shield, that said to these platforms, if you edit and if you block and if you try to keep your platforms cleaned up, we're not going to consider you to be a publisher. We're not going to saddle you with that legal liability. The whole idea was to create a legal structure where they can block and edit without being considered a publisher. And now what Josh Hawley wants to do is force them to be considered a publisher. And as I described, you're either going to end up with a whole lot less user-generated content, or you're going to end up with a situation where decent people are afraid to go onto the internet because of all of the filth and all of the objectionable material that ends up on these platforms.
And as I understand it, President Trump is somewhat sympathetic with Josh Hawley and would like something to be done. But it's fair to say this has to be, whatever changes come, if any changes come, have to be done by law as opposed to executive order. Is that a fair assessment?
That is exactly right. And by the way, there's no such thing as a perfect law. So I'm not suggesting that it's not possible to tweak and make some improvements on some of these laws and regulations. I do think it's problematic when you have a dominant platform like Twitter or Facebook, and people have this perception that the whole platform has adopted a particular political slant and is discriminating against one side or the other. So it is possible that there are some careful changes and tweaks that can be made to the law that would fix that. But what people need to understand is what is at stake. And the reason you can participate on these user-generated platforms like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and Reddit, the reason you can participate on those platforms without just drowning in a sea of pornography and objectionable material is because of Section 230.
Good.
And it's because of this shield.
My guest has been Tom Giovanetti, president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. You can find out more about IPI by going to pointofview.net, or you can go to IPI.org. When we come back, we're going to change gears again and go to Michael Schellenberger talking about Apocalypse Never, why environmental alarmism hurts us all. Stay with us and we'll be back.
A couple of weeks ago, Point of View and you were presented with a challenge. It was a welcome challenge, but a challenge nonetheless. Nearing the end of our fiscal year and trying hard to make sure we're fully prepared to be a voice of truth and reason in the second half of the year, one friend of Point of View stepped up and said he would donate $50,000 if other listeners would match it. And as we were trying to finish up that rush challenge, we got another call and another $50,000 gift to match by July 15th, today. Well, we're extremely thankful to say it looks like we made it. Because of you, we were able to match not just one, but both $50,000 challenges. And I assure you, that's critically important as we move into the late summer and fall of 2020. We need the truth as we continue facing the threat of COVID-19 and as the presidential election season finally gets into high gear. We are so much better prepared for these challenges because of your sacrifices on behalf of the Truth Team. So from Kirby and the entire team in Dallas, we thank God for you. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
This is Merrill Matthews sitting in today for Kirby Anderson. Thank you for joining us. And I've really been looking forward to this hour because we're going to be talking with Michael Shellenberger, who is the author of Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. It's a new book just out in this year. It's a big book, and I've gone through it. It's very comprehensive. Michael Shellenberger is he's a lifelong environmental activist, and he's the founder and president of Environmental Progress, and that he advises policymakers in countries around the world. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, I was thrilled at your book. You've addressed so many issues in there with copious footnotes, pointing out things that a lot of us have said for some time. A person can be concerned about the environment, can believe that in fact you've got climate change going on, the Earth is warming, and other things of that nature. But some of the environmental movement has just undertaken things that are either counterproductive, hyperbolic, in some cases just flat false, and oftentimes just are hypocritical, and don't address the problems in a realistic way that would still meet the needs of people while trying to recognize that some changes may need to be made. So thank you for joining us. As you say in your book, you've been a lifelong environmentalist. You started at a young age. Give us a little background about how you got involved in the environmental movement.
Well, sure. So let's see. Just something about my family. My parents were Mennonite Christians, which is the same religious tradition as President Eisenhower, but it's a famously pacifist tradition. They were not Amish, but they lived with and near Amish, and Mennonites were. Many actually were Amish, including my grandfather, before they became Mennonites. So it's a tradition that is an interesting tradition. It's an American tradition. But it's always been a little bit outsider in the society. So they were conscientious objectors during war, with the exception, of course, of Eisenhower, who's one of the heroes in my book, who obviously becomes a military man, but also I think a man of peace in his advocacy for nuclear energy. I was a very left-wing kid, started Amnesty International chapter at 15, raised money for Rainforest Action Network at 16. I went to Nicaragua when I was 17 to support the Sandinista Revolution. I then helped raise money for Guatemalan cooperatives. I always cared about lifting people out of poverty, and I also loved the natural environment because my parents took us camping, and they were avid outdoors people. So I always appreciated all sorts of different natural environments, including forests and deserts. And then as I got older, I came to understand, and particularly living in poor countries, that economic growth and economic development and having homes with running water and electricity were all really great things, and that anybody who said differently had never probably lived without them, and that a lot of what environmentalists said was wrong, both in terms of describing poverty as somehow better for either people or the natural environment, and often said by people that had no experience living in real poverty. So my book is about those issues. Apocalypse Never is sort of about why they've exaggerated climate change, which is, my view, is real, is a problem, but is not the most serious environmental problem. and has been used basically to keep poor countries down, make energy more expensive in the United States as a way to slow growth. And they've promoted renewables, which for inherently physical reasons cause more damage to the natural environment than fossil fuels. And that anybody any truly radical environmentalist should be radically in support of nuclear energy, because it's far and away the best form of energy on every environmental measure. So, Amy, that's a very fast summary of Apocalypse Never, but it covers about 33 years of my life. I'm in my late 40s, so hopefully that's an introduction for the listeners.
You know, you talked about the indigenous populations, and there's a mindset, goes back to, I think, even classical Rome, of the idea of the noble savage, that somewhere there's this person who's living in tune with nature. They haven't been corrupted by capitalism. They haven't been corrupted by religion, specifically Christianity, I think some of the thinking goes. And those indigenous populations are just very, very special. And the left seems to oftentimes want to keep them in that position. And you mentioned this in your book, and that's been my sense as well, that when you go and talk to those populations, they'd like to have electricity. They'd like to have hot and cold running water. They'd like to be able to make an income and have some leisure time and other things. They don't necessarily see the nostalgia for being poor and indigenous that some of our wealthier people seem to impose upon them.
Well, that's right. And I would just say, I think there's two sort of different groups in the sense that there are intact indigenous communities in the world, like Native American tribes in the United States or Native American tribes in Brazil, that are sort of intact communities of people where there's a whole history there. And then there's just a lot more people that are just poor and that are often, for example, the people I worked with in Brazil were the descendants of slaves, just like African Americans in the United States. Most African Americans in the United States are descendants of slaves, of enslaved people, I should say. And in Brazil, very similar situation. But the difference was in Brazil, they were very, very poor. They were very poor small farmers. They were much more like where, African American sharecroppers, after the Civil War, very, very poor, living in on the forest frontier. Part of the difference in Brazil is that they never had this land grant act, which allowed for really American prosperity. It's the basis of it, and that the people had the benefits of the land. It was all locked up by the Portuguese royalty, and then by other feudal landlords in Brazil. So they never quite had the prosperity we had. But for sure, what you're saying is correct. I mean, you don't find poor people complaining that we consume too much. Those are complaints of rich people, first world problems. And I think we Americans, obviously, we don't think about poor countries, and maybe there's no need to, but I wanted this book to remind people that these environmental problems have always obviously been related to development and using natural resources for human development as opposed to for conservation, and that there's both real-world trade-offs, but also there's a bunch of opportunities as we get richer to actually conserve more nature as well as guarantee prosperity.
Michael, we're going to take a break in about a minute. And as we do, give it some thought to, I'd like to know when you decided to make the change. I mean, what was happening in your life? What age were you? I assume it was a sort of a gradual process where you said, some of the things I've been engaged in are just, I'm seeing problems here, and you begin to sort of speak out on another side, raising some of these concerns. My guest for this hour is Michael Schellenberger. He is the author of Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All, and some of the problems that are happening within the environmental movement. If you want to know more about him, you can go to pointofview.net. We have a link to him, his picture, his biography, and also a link to the book so that you can find out more about Apocalypse Never. It's a new book, so I would encourage you to take a look at that and consider getting a copy of it. Michael, stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, in the midst of the debates about which lives matter is a more important question as to why lives matter at all. This is not a commentary about Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. This is a more fundamental question. If you start with an evolutionary view that all life is a result of chance, then on what basis can you argue that any life is more important than any other? One of the guests on my radio program argues that if you accept naturalistic Darwinism, then no lives matter. So in the midst of this debate and discussion, you would hope that Americans living in a society influenced by Judeo-Christian values might have a better answer. But that is not what George Barna has found in his latest survey through the Cultural Research Center. He concluded that less than 4 in 10 of Americans today view human life as having unconditional intrinsic worth. Most of these people are found in the deeply religious segments of society. You know, as you might expect, an evolutionary view surfaced in the research. 1 out of 8 claimed that people are merely material substance or biological machines. Even more interesting was the fact that another 1/8 argued that people are part of the mind of the universe. Some people even argue that humans are an illusion, and others said that we're a sleeping god, part of the soul of the universe. A substantial share of the population combined to offer views such as life is what you make it, but it has no absolute value, and life does not attain its full value until we reach our highest point of evolution and expression. All of this suggests that the best question to ask is why any life matters and on what basis. Americans obviously have some very confused ideas about this. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and my guest this hour, Michael Schellenberger, author of Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. And as it turns out, you can go to pointofview.net to find out more about him. But in a completely unrelated thing, the institute I'm with, Institute for Policy Innovation, will be hosting Michael in a Zoom call on August the 6th. I believe that's available on our website, that information now at ipi.org. So you can go and check that out, and you'll also be able to get a copy of his book from that if you're interested. So you can go to Amazon or you can go to ipi.org. Both gives you an option to get a copy of this book, and I would recommend that you do that. Michael, when we broke, I said you started out as a leftist and environmental activist, and somewhere you began to change. What part of your career did you begin to see? There's some issues here that we need to discuss. Were people receptive to that? Were they critical of it? And at what point did you feel like, well, I've kind of got to make a break with the mainstream environmental movement because it's just not responding to what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to know there's really two separate movements, and they're discussed in this book, which is that there's a left-wing movement that comes out of Marx and becomes socialism, and then kind of in the 60s rejects a bunch of the Stalinistic, authoritarian parts of it and becomes more left-wing anarchism, which I think is the dominant form of the radical left in the United States. Mm-hmm. But then there's this environmentalism, which comes out of Malthusianism, which had traditionally been the enemy of Marx. Marx and Engels called Malthus, I'm referring to Thomas Malthus, the 18th century economist, who said that there would always be overpopulation that resulted in famine. Mm-hmm. Basically, that's what he said, for just kind of inherent physical reasons. he was completely wrong.
He was, yes, indeed.
Is the case. Yeah, it's like always been wrong.
But that's never stopped people from embracing it.
Right. But that was the enemy of Marx. Marx and Engels called Malthus a stain on the human race. They were not subtle in their view of him. So the question in the book was like, how did those two movements basically come together in the 60s? And I got to the bottom of it. It was driving me crazy for like a decade for Apocalypse Never. And so for me, though, I never was Malthusian. So I never thought, it always struck me as something racist about it, that it was always aimed at people that weren't white and in poor countries, which it is. Even when people, in the United States say, I think there's too many people, it's still usually it's aimed at other countries. And in fact, we see it with the climate change policies. That's like they are able to change World Bank policies more easily than they can change, than they can make energy more expensive, although even that's changed in the United States. So for me, though, I was always more of a what you call social justice warrior, more of a socialist. And then it was actually I then realized very early that climate change was depressing me, just without any kind of analytical. I had no sort of understanding of the energy economy or food or energy production or climate science or environmental science, really. But I knew that I would read about the environment, and I would find it depressing as opposed to reading about the civil rights movement, which was inspiring. And I was interested in that, and then became very interested in the idea that maybe things that were depressing, it might be wrong, that it might be one-sided, that there might be more complexity to it. I then became a big advocate of renewables as a technical fix to climate change. It then became clear that renewables had all these problems. They required so much land. They killed wild animals, especially the industrial wind turbines. The solar farms didn't work very well. None of it was reliable. It actually required having backed up by fossil fuels. It made electricity expensive. And then finally, somebody was just, eventually Stuart Brand, some people were like, why not just do nuclear? And at that point, I think I was like, well, I don't know. Isn't nuclear, dangerous? And then people would say, well, not really. And then I read about it, and I was like, wow, nuclear is really not at all what I thought it was. Nuclear energy is the safest. It's an overreaction to these problems, which are actually completely understandable industrial problems with the early new energy source. And from there, then you kind of go, well, then why are we doing renewables at all? Doesn't seem to make any sense. Why would you bother with it? And then when you understand the history of why they advocate renewables, it opens up the story of that it's really just this Malthusian desire to really end growth and deprive countries of prosperity, and that it's really being proposed by the richest people in the world, and it's got something pretty darn wrong with it, and maybe even sinister. And that's where I got to the bottom of it with Apocalypse Never, was like, there's a lot that's wrong with it. And then in terms of the socialist parts of me, I'm just older. And the older you get, the less socialist you become. I think Churchill said that, right? Which is that you just kind of go, markets have these really important functions. In the book, I talk about the whales. The Russians kept whaling after it was not economical to do so because vegetable oil replaced whale oil, and the Russians, the Soviets, they kept whaling because they were deciding not based on price but on politics. And I use that story in the book to sort of point out the ways in which price obviously plays this really important role in telling us how to use resources more efficiently, not just human labor, but also resources. So I think hopefully that captures the whole. That probably captures about 20 years of my evolution, I hope. How
did your friends and colleagues respond? Because I assume over this time span, you're beginning to say, you raise questions and raise points. Did they say, it's a very good point, Michael, let me consider that? Or did they feel like you were either abandoning them, had been bought out, or what was the response of your friends?
Well, yes, what you just said. I have had three separate distinct periods lost significant financial support and friendships in three separate moments One was simply criticizing the dominant mode of environmental policymaking, which was carbon pricing and cap and trade.
Mm-hmm.
The second was on becoming pro-nuclear, and then the third was on rejecting renewables.
Yes, yes.
And this book was, in a sense, I had lost. I lost. I started a new organization, and then I lost donors over this question, and I also lost donors over the question of being critical of what's called so-called advanced nuclear, which is basically, untested nuclear, experimental nuclear, which I just think is a distraction.
Mm-hmm.
And I testified in front of Congress to that effect, and I basically decided to do Apocalypse Never. There's a lot of motivations, but one of them was I just needed to tell the whole truth that I knew in one place, and then if it meant I lost donors, fine, but at least the donors that stuck with me and the friends that would stick with me were my true friends and donors who would stick with me. So that's basically what's happened. I even lost. I just lost about a fifth of my organization's budget over the last 2 weeks.
Mm. Well, and of course, count me a friend, but what you say in your book is just absolutely undeniable. You're absolutely right, I think, on virtually every point that you make in the book about raising certain concerns. And of course, one of those is the alarmism that comes out, in which you have, you mentioned, I think you have a chapter called The Sixth Extinction, where you have people coming out, and you see this now. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We've got to have the Green New Deal by 2030, or we're all gonna die. If you're trying to be a little more moderate, you say by 2050. But this notion that the world is coming to an end in the next decade if we don't go to a radical environmental agenda is just crazy. And then it's not just environmentalism, Michael. They add in all kinds of other things. We've got to do social justice. We've got to do certain minimum wages. We've got to retrofit. We've got to do all these things, which you sort of come away from. This doesn't sound like you're just concerned about carbon dioxide increasing. It sounds like you're trying to do a whole Marxist agenda in something and wrap it in environmental concerns.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just gotten kind of crazier and more extreme over the years. I mean, what can I say? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me. I mean, the book ends by basically looking at, the book's in sort of thirds. The first third is a debunking of popular myths on climate change, species extinction, deforestation, plastic waste. And then the middle part of the book is about how humans save nature in the real world by not using it, by using it less, through technological advance and markets and prosperity. And then the last third of the book is ask the question, why, if environmental problems are manageable and not the end of the world, did we come to see them as apocalyptic? And why, in particular, is the left doing this? And it basically concludes that environmentalism is the new religion.
Stay with us. We'll be back with Michael Schellenberger in just a minute.
A couple of weeks ago, Point of View and you were presented with a challenge. It was a welcome challenge, but a challenge nonetheless. Nearing the end of our fiscal year and trying hard to make sure we're fully prepared to be a voice of truth and reason in the second half of the year, one friend of Point of View stepped up and said he would donate $50,000 if other listeners would match it. And as we were trying to finish up that rush challenge, we got another call and another $50,000 gift to match by July 15th, today. Well, we're extremely thankful to say it looks like we made it. Because of you, we were able to match not just one, but both $50,000 challenges. And I assure you, that's critically important as we move into the late summer and fall of 2020. We need the truth as we continue facing the threat of COVID-19 and as the presidential election season finally gets into high gear. We are so much better prepared for these challenges because of your sacrifices on behalf of the Truth Team. So from Kirby and the entire team in Dallas, we thank God for you. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to talk to our guest, Michael Schellenberger, who is the author of Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. Michael, you turn to nuclear energy as sort of the solution, and there was a time years ago where people were very optimistic about the potential for nuclear energy. I was back in grade school. I picked up a book that was published in 1957 called Peacetime Uses of Atomic Energy. I'm showing the audience a copy of it right now. And it was a very optimistic, in 1957, very optimistic look of how nuclear energy was going to be able to help us in so many ways. And my sense is that the environmental movement early on sort of looked favorably upon nuclear energy as a clean source of essentially unlimited energy for us from now on into the future. But they turned on that dramatically, I guess, in the 1970s. What happened there?
Right. So just like you said, the president of the Sierra Club, who is this wonderful, accomplished mountaineer, he was a veteran of the Manhattan Project, which had created the bomb, studied the effects of radiation and altitude on the body, was a biologist, lived in Berkeley, basically got California's last nuclear plant built, Diablo Canyon, by supporting the utility PG&E as I wanted to build that. So the book looks at what happened within the Sierra Club, because that was such a critical organization, that it went from being pro-nuclear power, recognizing the need for prosperity and energy, to becoming anti-nuclear and anti-economic growth and anti-prosperity, anti-modernity, and really attributing it to the marriage of this Malthusianism and socialism. And it was sort of the worst aspects of both. It was all of the humanity and appreciation of progress and technology that existed still in Marx and Engels was removed and replaced by a kind of primitivism. And even Malthus, who I've responded to some of Malthus's defenders, who have pointed out that he was a more subtle economist than sometimes people give him the credit for. I don't think it changes my verdict of him, but nonetheless, all that's gone, and it just gets the kind of dumb, basic view that people have today, which is that economic growth, the more economic growth you have, the worse the environment is, and that's just false. We know that's not true, but that's what happened, and it really happens around this hatred of nuclear energy. And, it's obviously affected as well by the fear of nuclear weapons, which is a real fear, an important fear. We should be afraid of nuclear weapons, but a kind of displacement of that fear onto nuclear power plants, which became sort of the symbol of just too much progress, too much modernity, and it was that occurs. And I think it's that in the culture and the society is there on all sorts of stuff that we see, I think, which is desire to go back. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Well, you make the case in the book that if you look at the numbers, nuclear energy is one of our safest forms of energy. If you just look at the raw numbers of people who've been hurt and so forth, because there's been so very few incidents with it.
Right. I mean, it's amazing, actually. I mean, the thing you have to know about nuclear is it's a completely different field of science, a different field of technology. I mean, it comes out of physics. Comes right out of laboratory physics. They split the atom in a lab. There's no big infrastructure required. Making the bomb, of course, power plants, those require huge infrastructure. But just the knowledge of splitting the atom comes right out of just in the lab work. And so you would expect this whole new industry would have some accidents at the beginning. Most people are familiar with how airplane crashes have declined dramatically, huge decline in deaths from plane crashes. It's wonderful, even as jet travel has increased. It's the same with most technologies. You have problems at the beginning. You would expect to have problems. Problems with nuclear energy are that when there's a loss of coolant, which is the normal water that's used to cool the hot reactors, they can melt, and if some amount of radioactive particles escape, it can harm people. Just turns out that radiation is a lot less harmful than people think, than people realize, and that the amount of particulate matter, the amount of radioactive particulate matter that escapes from a nuclear plant during an accident is just so little that the harm is very little, and that really the exaggerated response had to do with, there were political reasons for it, as we described, but also I think a kind of sense in which it was like a bomb, and that it would have a big bomb-like impact. And in reality, I point out that really the best we can tell from science is that Chernobyl, which is this, it's become a kind of television series. It's become a huge event. Chernobyl might kill 200 people total. It's shocking. Nobody believes it when I say it, so I spent several pages in the book going through why we really couldn't say that more people than that died. There's just no evidence of any increase in cancers other than thyroid cancers after Chernobyl. So I think the fears themselves in the case of nuclear are really what's harmed people.
And of course, one of the knocks on nuclear energy is these days is it costs so much to create the plants. But I think you argue that it's because groups step in and work so hard, filing lawsuits and other things to prevent them, that it delays the creation of them, and it just adds to cost, making nuclear. I think you argue it would be fairly cheap to do that, but it's not so much given the resistance that we have.
Yeah, so it's my basic view of energy is that natural gas replacing coal is good, but natural gas replacing nuclear is bad. That basically there's just a hierarchy of value there. America is blessed to have abundant natural gas, and so we're in a transition which for some communities, obviously West Virginia, some parts of Pennsylvania, Ohio, is painful in the sense of the transition from coal to natural gas. And nuclear, we have this, amazing, fleet of almost 100 nuclear reactors around the country and about 60 different power plants, provides about 20% of our energy. If people really cared about climate change, they would be seeking to expand nuclear, and that's not what climate alarmists are doing. And so I point out that, if the left, because conservatives tend to be either fine with nuclear or pro-nuclear, I think in part because they do have a more positive view of the U.S. military, and which is nuclear armed. But I point out that if you really do care about climate change and even just reducing environmental impacts from air pollution or land use, we would just build on that 20% and take it to 50% or more like the French at 75%.
Let's go to Jim in Oklahoma. He has a question for you. Jim, you're on the air.
Okay, thank you. I was interested in your thumbnail biography. You mentioned you'd been to Nicaragua. I used to fly missionary flying from Canada to Costa Rica, but I was there both pre-Sandinista when Somoza was in charge and afterwards, and it was like difference between night and day. The freedom under Somoza, he was more or less of a benevolent despot, and I'm just wondering what years you were there and what you found out under the Sandinistas.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. I mean, I was there. I mean, it's kind of crazy when I look back on it. I somehow persuaded my parents to let me go to Nicaragua when I was 17. I mean, I looked like I was 12. It was wild. I mean, there was a civil war going on, right? It was towards the end of the Civil War, and it was clear that the Sandinista army, with the support of the Soviet Union and Cuba, was winning, that it was going to defeat the counterinsurgency supported by the United States. And then, of course, what happens is basically the Nicaraguans do exactly what the British did after World War II, which is that they then were like, thank you very much, you've won the war, and now we're going to vote in the different party, which some people claimed was like a return of the Somozas, but it really wasn't. It was just the return of kind of the the rich people, that kind of, the more of the bourgeoisie that ran Nicaragua. And boy, was it free when I was there? I'm sure there were some amount of political prisoners. I just don't remember exactly. But it wasn't exactly like a police state either. It certainly wasn't a police state in the ways that, we met with like people that wrote for the opposition newspapers. There was censorship at some points, though I'm not sure it was significantly more than maybe what we had in the United States during World War II. Some of it had to do with kind of military operations. Anyway, I'm not defending whatever authoritarianism they had, but it was an intense time.
Michael, stay with us, and we'll be back for our final segment with Mike Schellenberger in just a minute.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to our final segment with Michael Schellenberger, author of Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. Michael, in this last segment, I'd like you to address a couple of things that you have chapters on in the book. Number one, why clean and renewable energy isn't all that clean. I've been writing about that myself, but it needs to be stressed. And number two, the hypocrisy of many of the environmentalists who will take private jets to major conferences to lecture all the rest of us about how we should be using less energy.
Yeah, I mean, this is the real motivation. I mean, there's really two groups of people. There's your ordinary environmentalists for whom renewables, solar and wind, it's like buying something labeled natural at the grocery store.
Organic.
Yeah, they don't think about it. It sounds good. I mean, I think there's an interesting question which I explore, which is why did we ever think that natural, how did we come to think natural was good? Because we didn't always think that. Humans didn't always think that. But that's most people. It's not very thoughtful. But there's a deeper, more influential group of the Malthusian intellectuals, the heads of the environmental groups, who they have always liked renewables precisely because they are inefficient, because they make energy expensive, and they want energy to be expensive and scarce because they think it basically slows down the human cancer. I don't think the evidence supports any of that. I think there's all this evidence of what we call decoupling, where more energy use, if you look at your iPhone, think of all the stereos, televisions, cameras, alarm clocks, calendars, all the different things that replaced. It's an incredible environmental breakthrough, but of course it requires a lot of energy, so you need energy to save nature. Anyway, renewables, I don't think people know they have that, and then the other issue, of course, is just the inefficiency in terms of land. They require 300 to 400 times more land than nuclear or natural gas, and so they're terrible for landscapes. And then the wind turbines are the worst because the blades spin and they kill insects, birds, and bats, some of which are endangered species. So that chapter, by the way, is called Destroying the Environment in Order to Save It. That's the idea of renewables, was that it'll take us to some more natural existence, but in fact it ends up having the opposite impact.
And of course, Michael Moore has released his, he was executive producer of a film that was released here recently. I watched it. And of course, he's come to the same conclusion. I mean, they thought that all these things, biomass and renewable energy from wind turbines or solar panels and so forth would be cheaper and cleaner, and they come to think they're not really either. And even then, you have to have a lot of fossil fuels energy backing those up because they're intermittent and they don't always provide energy.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they have to have either hydro usually or natural gas that can quickly scale up or down. But, California, we pay Arizona to take our garbage electricity from solar because we can't use it. It would blow out the grid. So we have to pay people to take it. The Germans have to pay people to take their excess wind. It's just, it's funny because I used to advocate for it, but basically renewables are a terrible form of energy. It's just there's no two ways about it. The supposed climate benefits of less carbon emissions and air pollution are not as great as people think because they do require this natural gas backup, and the other environmental impacts are so terrible. It's just why I just think we should just stop using it and just do natural gas and nuclear.
And talk about the hypocrisy there, because as you mentioned in the book, Al Gore ends up selling his network to Al Jazeera, which ends up making his money off oil. And Al, I've seen him say, I didn't really see a problem with that. It's interesting that many of what I would call elites who support environmentalism fly around and they drive their Prius to the airport, take a private jet somewhere using 10 to 20 times more energy than it would if they were just flying on a commercial airline, and yet lecture the rest of us on how we need to cut back on energy, even though they don't.
Right. And I think the two things are related to the sense that I think they feel, they're sort of having it both ways. On the one hand, they feel guilty because they know that they're having these huge environmental impacts because they're so rich, and some of them might feel guilty for being rich. But then they also, I think there's also, so they moralize hypocritically and unknowingly. They're just being, just to be unkind about it, they're just being pretty dumb celebrities. But I do think there's something else too, which is that I think they get to kind of have it both ways. They get to be rich and flaunt it, and they also get to moralize. So in some ways, they get to do both, and which I think would just be annoying for the fact that they're also changing what World Bank funds. The World Bank used to fund hydroelectric dams, roads, electrical grids. Now it funds workshops and, giving people in the countryside a solar panel and a battery rather than helping, with fertilizer, irrigation, with economic development. And I think that's what bothers me about it. It's not just the hypocrisy there and the way they look down on all of us, but it's also the ways in which they're really trying to keep other people around the world down.
Can we turn this around? I mean, it just seems like the environmental movement is growing as more and more businesses are funneling money that way. And in what I would consider in many cases sort of not very efficient or productive ways, it seems like those who are raising questions about this and saying, yes, the Earth may be warming. It's been warming since the last ice age. Humans release a lot of carbon dioxide. We may be exacerbating the climate change, but there are serious ways to address some of these problems without destroying economies or individuals. Do we turn this around where that argument becomes the leading argument as opposed to we've got to all shut down and move to a Green New Deal?
Yeah, I mean, I think the change has to be made by conservatives, by Republicans, to actually have a proactive, positive environmentalism that's a clear alternative to the just completely crazy, unethical, Malthusianism of the left, and the Republicans traditionally, when I talk to them about it, they say, well, that's a left-wing issue, and so they don't touch it. I don't think that's the right way to think of it at all, especially with industrial wind turbines killing wildlife, especially with, these efforts to deprive prosperity to poor countries. I don't know any Republican who thinks that's okay, and yet many Democrats are going along with it, including senators, right? Including very senior Democrats, very wealthy Democrats. So my view is that really what needs to change is that Republicans need to affirm a very different form of environmentalism, one that is pro-human. You can just call it pro-human environmentalism. And that would then affect the change. I'm more of, at this point, a moderate Democrat myself, but honestly, I think that moderate Democrats would be better off if we had Republicans criticizing the radical left with us, because I think that the radical left is what's taken control here. It doesn't have anything really to do, obviously it doesn't. It's not about protecting the natural environment. The radical left is about taking control of the economy, taking control over people's lives. It wants power, it wants control. And that's why it's so messy what they're proposing. They're just proposing more money for their programs and organizations and people to have more political control. And I don't think it's good enough for Republicans to just say we need small government and free markets. I think Republicans need to say, here's what we need to do to save the natural environment.
If people want to reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
People should just email me. I answer every email I get, and I can't always respond at length, but I always respond unless people are rude. But usually I respond. And it's just michaelschellenberger@gmail.com.
Good. Thank you. My guest this hour has been Michael Schellenberger, author of Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. You can find out more about that at pointofview.net. We have a link to the book on Amazon, I believe, and it is one of the best books I think I've seen on environmentalism, as it's addressing an awful lot of the issues out there and does so in a very intelligent, balanced way. So thank you so much for joining us, Michael.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you. And that wraps up this show. Very interesting program this day with a lot of things. But anyway, take a look at Michael's book. We'll be back tomorrow.
A couple of weeks ago, Point of View and you were presented with a challenge. It was a welcome challenge, but a challenge nonetheless. Nearing the end of our fiscal year and trying hard to make sure we're fully prepared to be a voice of truth and reason in the second half of the year, one friend of Point of View stepped up and said he would donate $50,000 if other listeners would match it. And as we were trying to finish up that rush challenge, we got another call and another $50,000 gift to match by July 15th, today. Well, we're extremely thankful to say it looks like we made it. Because of you, we were able to match not just one, but both $50,000 challenges. And I assure you, that's critically important as we move into the late summer and fall of 2020. We need the truth as we continue facing the threat of COVID-19 and as the presidential election season finally gets into high gear. We are so much better prepared for these challenges because of your sacrifices on behalf of the Truth Team. So from Kirby and the entire team in Dallas, we thank God for you. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.